This one here, we're going to go into a few exercises for hip mobility and how to make it as functional as possible. Now, when we're thinking of mobilising the hip, we need to be thinking of more than the hip, because the hip isn't just a hip, it's connected to everything else. Everything in the body is connected to everything else in the body. That's the way we move. Even if I did say, I'm going to mobilise my hip and say I'm going to go into hip extension. As soon as I go into hip extension, it's not just hip extension, go into hip extension. I've now got plantar flexion of the foot. I've now got knee extension. I've actually gone into internal rotation of the opposite hip. I've actually gone into my thoracic spine now, because I've come forward on the left. My thoracic spine is actually rotated to the right, and my cervical spine is actually rotated to the left. So just by that one movement here, I've not just isolated the hip, I've moved every joint in the body. Everything is connected. So I think if we have a hip that is immobile, if it's not moving correctly, rather than trying to free up the hip, I think to myself, well, if the hip's not moving, it's not moving. No matter how much I try and free that up, it just doesn't want to do it, and there's probably a good reason it doesn't want to do it. It's probably locking up for somewhere else in the body. So I think to myself, well, so rather than trying to free the hip up, what if I'm better off trying to free it up from other muscles in the body, from other movement patterns? So if I want this hip to go into hip extension and it's not going there, if I just throw this arm back, it gives me hip extension. If I throw my right arm back, my left hip comes up into hip extension. So now we're getting our hip extension, but we're kind of tricking the body. We're tricking it a little bit because we're not asking the body for hip extension. We're just asking it to throw our right arm back and we get left hip extension, or we throw our left arm back and we get right hip extension. That's the way it works. So to me, it makes more sense if this is already stuck. Don't try freeing it up. Use the rest of the body to free it up, and then the hip will just free up naturally because everything moves together. It doesn't move just on its own. So we're just going to go through some exercises how we can free the hip up. So now, just say I want hip extension. All I do is just come up. As soon as I just start throwing my arms back like that, I'm already starting to get hip extension. So then if I just step forward with that, that gives me more hip extension now. We're coming through more here. Yeah, so just step forwards, throw the arms back. Already gives me more hip extension. And for the other side, it's the same. So then I think, well, I've got hip extension, but now how about if I want internal rotation of the hip? If I just step across, straight away, I've got internal rotation of that hip. If I turn in, I've got even more internal rotation of that hip. But that is still working just roughly with the hip. So if I just do something natural, like I want a cup of tea over there, if I just bend, pick that cup of tea up, that's giving me internal rotation of that hip now. So if I just come across backwards and forwards, and then I just step round with it, that's already starting to free up this hip if there's a lack of internal rotation. If I want external rotation of the hip, I just bend the other way. So I come over here, I've left this hip here now, so it is internally rotating, but relative to the rest of the body, relative to my right leg and my right hip, because it's moving slower, it's actually getting relative external rotation, because I'm coming here, I'm leaving this behind now, this hip joint is actually opening up. If I just reach here instead, I'm now opening the hip joint up that way. So we've got hip extension here, we've got internal rotation, we've got external rotation. And obviously if I want my glute to fire, because if it's a weak glute, I just go into excessive internal rotation. Stretch this glute out, send the signal to the glute it needs to fire, we close the hip. Okay? One of the insertions for the glute is in the posterior, is posteriorly to the femur head. So when we go into internal rotation, that's sending a message to the glute to fire. So if I come here, so straight away, now I'm getting internal rotation. So to make that more functional, if I pick something up from the floor, I'm now getting internal rotation. This glute is firing without me asking it to fire, because it's just naturally doing it. I've used the shoulder, the thoracic spine rotation to get this glute firing. And then we do the same the opposite way as well. So it's just ways you can now start to free up the pelvis, mobilise the hip, get the glutes firing without directly targeting the hip. Because if it's locked up for a reason, I don't think it's going to want you to play around with it. And I don't think it's going to allow you to open it back up. Whereas if we just trick it and start doing all these other natural movements that our body does, why our brain is concentrating on these other movements, this will just naturally free up. So we have the intention of freeing up the hip, but we move through other natural movements to get it there, and then the fascia in the hip frees up with it as well. So we can take our pole, we can now use our pole as a lever, as an extra lever length. We can use the momentum of the pole as we come forwards to now free that hip up even more, because I'm now going to excessive shoulder flexion and spine extension. That frees up this hip. But I'm not throwing the hip forward, I'm just stepping forwards and throwing my arms back with the pole, and that starts to free up the hip. It starts to naturally put it into extension. If I want internal rotation, I'll just rotate with the pole. Now using the momentum of the pole to now close this hip, this is giving me internal rotation. If I wanted external rotation of this hip, I'll just let everything kind of go. So now here, I'm getting internal rotation of this hip, letting this leg free up. As this comes forward, this is going into external rotation now. This is going into flexion. This is going into hip extension now. This is coming forwards. So now as we're moving, we now start to see I can go into internal rotation of this hip, external rotation of this hip, and it's just natural kind of movement from my waist. I'm not reaching over here, but I'm using the bar, the momentum from the extra weight to carry it across, if that makes sense. So then think to yourself, well, so we're going into extension, internal rotation, extension, external rotation. So if we start doing a transverse move now, we can get more external rotation from this hip. So we just start reaching around. Transverse, well, just start doing a transverse lunge around. And I start to get external rotation of this hip. As I'm closing this back hip, external rotation here, internal rotation here. So we're using the pole as a lever to stretch our muscles out and stretch our fascia out. We're using our spine, our shoulders, our natural ways of moving our arms, things like this, to free our pelvis up and our hip up without targeting directly the hip. You can then do the same with the ball. So it's just a medicine ball, forwards extension, but now we can start to think, well, make it more functional. Obviously we want more transverse movement. Rotation is a functional move. So as we come in, step in, we just come over to the opposite shoulder now. So now, as I'm coming through, I'm now getting even more hip extension, and I'm getting transverse movement now. How do we walk? Left foot, right arm, transverse movement, cervical spine forwards, eyes are our driver, and we're getting transverse movement here. So we're closing this down, this is coming forwards, and we're coming through here. This is exactly what we're getting with this movement now. Back. If we want it more functional, we just make it more excessive. We can now come back. So if I want to stretch my glutes and my hamstrings out now, I can come back here. I'm now getting hamstring stretch here. I'm now coming back. I can come up onto the heel, incorporate the whole plantar fascia, whole posterior line, or I can have the toes down and just target more of the hamstring. But what we can do is we can use that now to start freeing up the hip capsule, the glutes, the hamstrings, the calf, right through to the plantar fascia, and then we can step through, externals, we can come through and through. So now, we're loosening the hip without even targeting the hip. We're just doing more movements. We're freeing up the hamstrings, we're freeing up the glutes, we're freeing up the muscles going into the hips, and we're freeing up the joints that may be restricting the hip from moving, and by doing that the hip is just going to comfortably want to move and comfortably want to free up because we're integrating it into the rest of the body. We can either come down here, so we've got our internal rotation here from our lunge, we've got internal rotation of this hip, and we can bring it down more, excessive rotation. So now I use the weight from the ball to give me more internal rotation of this hip. So now I'm closing it even more. If I want to open it more, I can do both together. I can come in, close it, step back, open it, close it, open. So the whole body is now moving. I can put transverse in with that. Turn, turn. So now, getting all three planes of movement through the hip. Internal rotation, extension, external rotation, and we're stretching this whole fascial line out, this front functional line. So that's just a few ways of mobilising the hip and getting everything moving again without directly targeting the hip, without isolating the hip, because joints don't work in isolation, they work as a system with the rest of our body. Okay, thanks.